A retired engineer in Michigan spent 38 years doing everything correctly. Contributed to the account every month without missing. Rebalanced annually the way his advisor told him to. Diversified across every asset class the managed account offered. Retired at 67 with $412,000. By 73 that number was $291,000. He had not made a single bad decision. He had not panicked and sold at the wrong moment. He had not deviated from the plan his advisor built for him. The money was simply leaving faster than the system he trusted was replacing it. He called his advisor. The advisor told him markets go through cycles. Stay the course. Trust the process. What the advisor did not tell him, what no institution in that man's financial life had ever told him, is that the outcome he was experiencing was not a cycle. It was architecture. The wrong architecture. Maintained across 38 years while every institution around him profited from leaving it undisturbed. Saudi dynastic families have watched that outcome repeat across an entire generation of American savers. They are not surprised by it. Because they recognize it immediately. It is what happens when wealth is built inside a system designed around institutional revenue rather than family preservation. And they have spent 100 years building something specifically designed to produce the opposite outcome. 1 ratio. 3 categories. A specific proportion that has not changed across generations of oil price collapses, regional wars, currency devaluations, and global financial crises. The 40/40/20 rule. 40% into physical hard assets, gold and land owned outright with no institutional claim attached. 40% into income-producing assets that exist completely outside the banking system. And 20% into something that has nothing to do with what most Americans assume liquid reserves are for. That third category is where this ratio separates itself from every allocation system the American financial advisory industry has ever produced. Because the 20% is not there for safety. It is not an emergency fund. It is not a conservative hedge sitting idle while the rest of the portfolio works. What Saudi dynasties actually do with that 20% is the specific reason this ratio makes financial collapse structurally difficult to achieve. Not difficult in the way a well-diversified managed account is difficult to collapse. Structurally difficult. Architecturally resistant. Built to function across all conditions before any specific condition arrives. That explanation is coming. But first understand why a person can spend 40 years inside the American financial system, contributing faithfully, diversifying correctly, trusting completely, and never once hear this ratio mentioned by anyone paid to give them financial guidance. Every dollar allocated according to the 40/40/20 rule is a dollar permanently outside the revenue model of every institution positioned to share it. The first 40% requires no advisor to maintain its value. The second 40% generates income that flows directly to the asset owner with no management relationship required. The 20% is held in a form that needs no institutional custodian. The entire ratio removes the family from the system that profits from keeping them inside it. That is not why it works. But it is precisely why a retired engineer in Michigan spent 38 years inside the American financial system and never once heard it mentioned. The architecture existed the entire time. The institutions that would have shared it simply had no financial reason to. If this channel is giving you what those institutions never did, subscribe. What comes next is the explanation that men deserved to hear 38 years ago. Most Americans divide their money by accident. Whatever remains after expenses goes wherever feels safest. Usually a bank account. Usually a managed retirement fund. Usually wherever the institution handling their paycheck suggested it go when they first started working. That is not a strategy. It is a default. And defaults are not neutral. Every dollar that flows into a default allocation is a dollar flowing into the allocation that benefits the institution receiving it. Not the family deploying it. Saudi dynasty families divide their money by design. Every dollar that enters the family structure is immediately classified into one of 3 categories and allocated in a specific proportion. That classification happens before the money has been sitting long enough to become comfortable where it lands. Before it has been sitting long enough to feel like it belongs in the managed account. Before the institution holding it has had long enough to make moving it feel complicated. The proportion is fixed. It does not change because markets are performing well. It does not change because an advisor recommends a different allocation for the current cycle. It does not change because one category is outperforming the others and concentration feels tempting. The 40/40/20 rule is not a response to conditions. It is a structure built before conditions arrive. That distinction, between responding to conditions and building a structure that functions across all of them, is the entire difference between the outcome the retired engineer in Michigan experienced and the outcome Saudi dynasty families have produced across 100 years of continuous disruption. The first 40% of every dollar goes into physical hard assets. Gold owned outright. Land held with no mortgage attached. Tangible assets that exist completely independently of any institution's fate. Not paper gold. Not a REIT. Not a managed fund with physical asset exposure. The physical asset itself. Held directly. Requiring no counterparty to maintain its value. This is the foundation layer. The 40% that no single event, no market crash, no institutional failure, no currency devaluation, no policy change, can reach simultaneously with everything else. Understand why this matters structurally. Every other asset category exists inside an institutional system. Managed accounts exist inside the brokerage system. Bank deposits exist inside the banking system. Paper financial instruments exist inside the market system. When any of those systems experiences stress, every asset inside it experiences that stress simultaneously. Physical hard assets held directly exist outside every one of those systems at the same time. In 2008, every institutional asset category experienced simultaneous decline. The managed accounts fell. The paper instruments fell. The bank-managed retirement funds fell. Physical gold held outside the banking system did not fall with them. Land owned outright with no mortgage attached did not fall with them. The families with 40% of their wealth in this category watched 2008 from a position of structural stability that the families with nothing in this category never experienced. Now understand what the American financial system told ordinary savers to do with this 40% instead. Put it in a managed account. Diversify it across paper asset classes. Let a professional manage it for an annual fee. Every one of those recommendations kept the 40% inside the institutional system. Every one of them generated ongoing advisory revenue. Physical gold in a personal safe generates nothing for an advisor. Land owned outright requires no management relationship. The 40% foundation layer removes 40% of a family's wealth from the advisory system permanently. That is not why Saudi families built the foundation there. But it is precisely why the American advisory system never suggested they do the same. A woman in Texas inherited 12 acres of farmland from her father in 1991. Her financial advisor at the time suggested she sell it and deploy the proceeds into a diversified managed portfolio. Liquidity, he called it. Flexibility. Professional management of a concentrated position. She sold. The managed portfolio performed adequately across the next 30 years. The 12 acres she sold appreciated at a rate the managed portfolio never matched. The advisor earned his transaction fee and his annual management percentage. The woman absorbed the permanent cost of having moved the foundation layer into an institutional system that had no structural reason to preserve it the way land preserves itself. The 40% foundation is not aggressive. It is not speculative. It is the layer that functions when everything else is being tested. Saudi dynasties have never reduced it. Not when oil revenues made paper assets feel more exciting. Not when advisors suggested reallocation toward higher performing instruments. Not once. Because the foundation is not there to perform. It is there to exist when performance becomes irrelevant and existence is what matters. Section 4. The second 40, income producing assets outside the banking system. The second 40% goes into assets that generate income from physical reality rather than institutional promises. Rental real estate producing monthly cash flow. Energy royalty instruments paying quarterly distributions from actual physical production. Business ownership generating revenue from actual economic activity. Not managed funds with exposure to these categories. Direct ownership positions that pay income regardless of what financial markets decide on any given day. The critical characteristic these assets share is worth stating precisely. Their income does not depend on an institution remaining solvent. A tenant pays rent because they need shelter. That need does not pause during a financial crisis. An energy royalty pays distributions because the physical resource exists and the infrastructure extracting it functions. That production does not stop because markets are declining. A business generates revenue because customers need what it provides. That need does not disappear because a brokerage is experiencing liquidity pressure. None of these income streams require a market to maintain confidence. None of them require a bank to remain healthy. None of them stopped functioning in 2008. Now contrast that with what the American financial advisory system offered ordinary savers as the primary alternative for this 40%. Bank savings accounts paying below inflation interest rates. Managed bond funds that move with the same institutional system experiencing simultaneous stress during any crisis. Certificates of deposit locking purchasing power into fixed returns denominated in a currency losing value every year. Every one of those products exists inside the banking system. Every one of them performs according to the banking system's health. When the system is healthy, they function adequately. When the system is stressed, they fail alongside it. Consider two retired couples in 2008. Same age. Same total wealth. Same amount of time spent building it. The first couple had their second 40% in a managed bond fund inside a bank-managed retirement account. The second couple had their second 40% split between two rental properties and an energy royalty trust they had held for 11 years. In October 2008, the first couple's managed bond fund declined alongside every other institutional asset experiencing simultaneous stress. In October 2008, the second couple received rent from both properties. They received their quarterly distribution from the energy royalty trust. The income from the second 40% did not pause to reflect what markets were doing. It arrived because physical reality does not pause for institutional crises. Same crisis. Same month. Completely different experience determined entirely by where the second 40% was held. The American financial advisory system knew both options existed. It consistently directed ordinary savers toward the first one. The reason has not changed across any of these videos. Income-producing assets held directly generate income for the owner. They generate no ongoing advisory fees. They create no management relationship that continues indefinitely. An advisor who helps a client acquire rental property or energy royalty positions has created a client who no longer requires active management. An advisor who keeps a client in a managed bond fund has created a revenue relationship with no natural endpoint. The second 40% was always available. The direction toward it simply never came from the people paid to give direction. If this ratio is giving you something your advisor never did, subscribe. The 20% explanation is coming. It is the category that changes everything about how this ratio actually works in practice. Most people hear 20% liquid reserves and think they understand what that means. Emergency fund. Cash in a savings account. 6 months of expenses sitting somewhere safe and accessible. That assumption is wrong. And the gap between that assumption and what Saudi dynasty families actually do with the 20% is the specific reason this ratio produces outcomes that no other allocation system reliably replicates. The 20% is not held for safety. It is held for two specific purposes that only become possible when the money is positioned correctly. Purpose 1 is protection during crisis. Purpose 2 is deployment during opportunity. And those two purposes require the 20% to be held outside the concentrated banking system that experiences stress at exactly the moments when both protection and opportunity matter most. Here is what this means in practice. When a financial crisis arrives, when institutional assets are declining and forced liquidations are creating distress prices across every asset category, the family with 20% in liquid reserves outside the banking system is not experiencing the crisis the same way as everyone else. They are watching it from a position of liquidity that exists outside the system being stressed. And they are seeing something that the families without this 20% cannot see clearly enough to act on. Distress prices. Assets being sold at fractions of their actual value by families who have no choice because their wealth is concentrated inside the system experiencing the stress. Forced sellers. Creating opportunities that only appear during periods of maximum institutional pain. The family with 20% liquid outside the system can act in that window. They can acquire assets at crisis prices that only exist for a specific period before recovery closes the window permanently. The family without this 20% watches the same window open and close without the ammunition to move through it. That asymmetry, between the family that can act during crisis and the family that can only survive it, is where generational wealth transfers occur. Not during periods of stability when everyone is positioned correctly and prices reflect full value. During periods of maximum stress when distress prices create acquisition opportunities that compound across the decades following the crisis. Saudi dynasty families have executed this pattern across every significant financial disruption of the last 100 years. They were not predicting the crises. They were simply positioned to act when the crisis created the conditions that always follow institutional stress. The American financial advisory system told ordinary savers to keep this 20% in a savings account earning below inflation interest inside the banking system. Inside the system experiencing the stress. Subject to the same institutional pressures that were creating the distress prices, the 20% was supposed to allow the family to act on. A savings account inside the banking system during a banking crisis is not liquidity. It is participation in the crisis. Saudi families held their 20% outside concentrated deposits. In physical cash. In short-term instruments convertible to deployable capital within 30 days without institutional friction. In a form that moves when the family decides to move it. No institution's approval required. No tax consequence from liquidating a managed position at the wrong moment. No market timing risk from selling a paper instrument during maximum stress to generate the cash needed to act. The 20% simply moves. Because it was never inside the system that needed to be exited first. Now understand what this 20% produced across a specific historical moment. In March of 2009, American real estate prices had fallen 40% from their 2006 peak. Energy assets were trading at fractions of their production value. Physical gold was available at prices that would never appear again. The families with 20% in liquid reserves outside the banking system were looking at a window of acquisition opportunity that the preceding 100 years had never produced as clearly. The families with everything inside institutional managed accounts were looking at statements showing 40% declines and advisors telling them to stay the course. Same crisis. Same moment. Two completely different positions. One created by architecture built before the crisis arrived. The other created by the absence of that architecture. The 20% is not conservative. It is the most strategically aggressive component of the entire ratio. Because it is the component that allows the family to act at the exact moment when acting produces the greatest long-term result. Saudi dynasties have maintained this 20% across 100 years of conditions that made deploying it elsewhere feel tempting. When oil revenues were strong and paper assets were performing. When advisors suggested the liquid reserves were underperforming and should be put to work inside the managed system. When concentration felt safe because nothing had gone wrong yet. The 20% stayed positioned. Because the families maintaining it understood something the institution suggesting they move it did not want them to understand. The 20% is not idle. It is loaded. And it fires at the exact moment that produces the outcomes that look like luck from the outside and look like architecture from the inside. 3 categories. One principle underneath all of them. The 40/40/20 rule is not 3 separate decisions made independently across a lifetime. It is one architectural decision made once and maintained permanently regardless of what conditions arrive to test it. 40% in physical hard assets that require no institution to maintain their value and cannot be reached by any single institutional failure. 40% in income-producing assets that generate cash flow from physical reality regardless of what financial markets decide. 20% in liquid reserves held outside concentrated deposits, positioned to protect during crisis and deploy during the acquisition windows that crises create. The 3 categories are designed to interact. When the institutional system experiences stress, the first 40% holds value independently. The second 40% continues generating income from physical reality. The 20% positions the family to acquire distressed assets at prices that only appear during maximum institutional pain. The family applying this ratio does not need to predict crises. They do not need to time markets. They do not need an advisor to tell them when to move. The structure responds to conditions automatically because it was built to function across all conditions before any specific condition arrived. That retired engineer in Michigan spent 38 years inside an allocation that was not built to function across all conditions. It was built to generate ongoing advisory revenue across all conditions. Those are not the same architecture. And the difference between them is not visible during the years when markets are stable and managed accounts are performing adequately. It becomes visible at exactly the moments when the architecture is tested. When the man is 73 and the number on the screen is 291,000 and the advisor is telling him to stay the course. The 40/40/20 rule was built for that moment. Built before that moment arrived. Built to ensure that moment never arrives. Saudi dynasties have maintained this allocation across 100 years of tests that reveal precisely which architecture was built for preservation and which was built for something else entirely. The answer has never changed. 1 ratio. 3 categories. One principle underneath all of it. Wealth is not destroyed by bad luck. It is not destroyed by market cycles or economic disruption or regional crises or global financial events. It is destroyed by wrong architecture maintained across decades while the institutions profiting from that architecture had every reason to leave it undisturbed. The 40/40/20 rule is the architecture Saudi dynasties built instead. It is not complicated. It does not require dynastic resources to understand or to begin applying at its principal level. It requires one decision: to stop organizing wealth according to the allocation that serves the institutions around the family and start organizing it according to the allocation that serves the family itself. The first 40% stops generating advisory fees and starts generating structural independence. The second 40% stops generating management commissions and starts generating income from physical reality. The 20% stops sitting inside the system being stressed and starts positioning the family to act when that stress creates the opportunities that produce generational outcomes. Every institution that would have shared this ratio had a financial reason not to. Every advisor who could have explained the 20% had a structural incentive to keep it inside the managed system instead. The ratio existed across 100 years of Saudi dynastic wealth preservation while an entire generation of American savers followed the allocation the advisors recommended and arrived at retirement with a number smaller than it should have been and shrinking faster than they expected. The architecture existed the entire time. The retired engineer in Michigan deserved to know it 38 years ago. If this channel is giving you what those institutions never did, subscribe. There is significantly more coming.